it's Sam. I'm making this quick video about something that's real important when you start trying to do astrology, and that is trying to synthesize what certain placements mean. You know, I get asked a lot of questions that will, start with something like, hey, I have Venus in Scorpio and it's aspected by Jupiter. What does that mean, right? And typically, it sounds very simple. It's just a couple things. And I'm asked, what does that mean? Is that good or bad? That often also follows. And there's no real, template to follow. People don't understand that, for instance, even just a planet in a sign is very complicated. However, it's also very manageable once you have a proper framework. So the thing is, one of the mistakes that people do is they try to synthesize things, like they'll try to synthesize that and then make a statement. So people will act, like in that example, I have Venus in Scorpio, what does that mean? And then it'll be something like, is that good or bad? Like, again, trying to box it into something really narrow that they're thinking I'm going to synthesize that and then say something about it, like a sentence that describes Venus in Scorpio, let's say aspected by Jupiter or in the 6th house or something, and I'm going to synthesize all that into a statement. And of course then the statement is like, is it good or bad? It's like just boxing it into something so narrow as to be completely unworkable. And the reason it's completely unworkable is because each one of these things are quite complicated, but yet, again, very understandable if you learn how astrology works. And that's what I'm going to talk about here, is this way to actually take something like that and make sense of it rather than trying to synthesize it. What you do is you expose it, or you unpack it. That's kind of a modern word. You explain it. And we sort of unpack that thing. That's kind of a modern term for it, and I really like it, because you're kind of like unpacking this thing that seems like it's this simple thing, because again, we can reduce it to a sentence and take, let's say 3 things. Venus in Scorpio in the 6th house. Okay, it's just 3 things. What? Venus, Scorpio, 6th house. Sounds simple, right? Well, Venus is like 15 attributes. Scorpio is like 15 attributes. The 6th house is like 15 attributes, right? Every one of those things, I could just talk about Venus, not even in your chart, but just Venus, and that would be a lot. Just Scorpio is a lot. Just the 6th house is a lot. Again, but it's not too much if you know how to manage it, and if you give up the idea that you're going to try to synthesize it into one sentence. So what an astrologer does when he's good, or she's good, is they understand all of these little details, and then you explain them. This is what astrology is. When you instead try to box an astrologer, or you try to box this thing into something oversimplified, what you do is you destroy the nuance. Life is in the subtle, elegant beauty, the contradictions, it's this way but it also has this. This is the whole range of potential that everything falls under in your life, including astrology. Of course, people want astrology to do something that is impossible, which is take all of the complications and subtleties of their life and reduce it to one simple sentence. Synthesize it into something that's easy for me to understand, and of course, good or bad. And of course, that doesn't work. So let's talk about how we can approach this in a way that's more reasonable. And of course, it's going to fall down to these universal Vedic frameworks and structures, because the Vedic principles and the Vedic system is so elegant and beautiful because it works through universal frameworks. So a couple of the most important ones are gunas, elements, and like masculine and feminine. These are a couple very important frameworks that we can start with. So if we were to take, let's say, Venus, actually let's take another one, which is its natural tendency. Like Venus is naturally gentle. Venus is rajasic. Venus is the karaka, or the indicator of relationship and interaction and compromise. So that's just, if we just start with those things. And Venus is oriented toward connection, which is more feminine in nature. So just those few things. Then we take Scorpio. Scorpio is ruled by Mars, which is about delineation and facing problems with courage, with confrontation, with facing things head on, with delineation and separation, like I said. It's feminine and psychological, so it's also internal. But it's also tamasic, which is about protection, and also about secrets and things that are not so open and so obvious. And then we take, let's say, the 6th house, which is one of the what are called Arcta houses, and it's about facing unpleasant situations and being of service to those things rather than getting into conflict over them. So these are like frameworks, and these are like the most high leverage frameworks that we have. So then we also have to understand that there's a range of potential. No matter how good or bad a planet is, let's say based on its dignity, it's still going to run the whole gamut of possibility. No matter what, Venus is sometimes going to be very trivial and very indulgent. But if it's well positioned, it's also going to be able to compromise and be tolerant with our desires and want to accommodate others. So again, this is a kind of range of potential. Scorpio is always going to have a little bit of like obsession, a little bit of paranoia, a little bit of exaggerating things toward the dark. But if it's a planet that does well there, it's going to take that energy and have more courage to open it up and be something that we learn from, where we learn from that and go deeper into our painful obsessions and therefore transform them, rather than just have them overwhelm and destroy things, as an example. So there's also that whole range of potential. So this is just kind of a backstory. So when someone has all of this in their mind already, like when I look at something like that, all of that is just kind of in the background. This is just kind of my sort of default setting. This is where I start the conversation. So I would start by just explaining the difference between some of these things. You just then compare and contrast. You're not synthesizing, like taking all of that and making one statement would be ridiculous. What you do instead, and as I say, what an astrologer does when they're good, is they unpack it. They explain it. First you need to know what it is, then you just say it. This is what I tell my students. This is why my students who have now graduated from the level 1 and are in the level 2 course and are doing readings, they've learned how to do this. They've learned how to take these things and say them. You just need to say it. So for instance, you would say, Venus is what's called a Rajasic planet, which is oriented towards happiness and fulfillment, first for ourselves and then sharing and harmonizing that with others, because at some point we realize that if it's all about me and my happiness, then I wind up suffering. So it's about sharing what I love and what I think is beautiful with the people that I love. Now, Venus in this case is in Scorpio, which is a tamasic sign, which is more oriented towards self-protection and more oriented towards making sure that those things that we love don't get taken away from us, because it's an emotional sign as well. So this quality of Venus to want to be sharing and wanting to take care of others might get a little overwhelmed by that emotionally stressful quality of Scorpio. However, for those people, let's say in your life, that you've already begun a deep emotional connection with, you will be very willing and very able and really try to please them and really want to merge your heart with theirs, because Scorpio is a water sign. However, Venus doesn't do as well in these water signs, because Venus is actually more related to air and earth. It's more about being flexible, like I get this, you get that, and also being solid and consistent because of the earthy quality, which says, since we're together, now I want to keep pleasing you and keep pleasing me. But again, Mars is the ruler of Scorpio, which is more about intensity and drama. So again, this can disrupt that quality of Venus, which wants to bring connection to things. So let me just stop there for a second. So that would be a quick way to integrate. I integrated 3 or 4 things right there. Elements, gunas, the nature of the planets. I didn't state it implicitly, but because Venus wants to maintain connection and Mars wants to make for distinction, I integrated that too into the nature of how that intensity of Mars can interrupt the desire of Venus to want to have connection. Mars wants distinction, Venus wants connection. Again, it's just comparison and contrast. I also found where things could be similar. I found the similarity between once you find someone that you love, you'll want to go deeper into that and you'll really be able to share and really want to merge with them because Venus in water. Love, water, that's finding sameness. So you look for sameness and difference. But first you need to know what those things are. It's very simple. It's very formulaic. Again, this is how I teach it in my certification programs, is first you need to understand all those things. We start with all these frameworks. Everything is about frameworks. And then you just start fitting these different things into those frameworks. So again, I wanted to make this quick video to kind of, go against the idea of how do you synthesize all of that? Get that out of your mind. Synthesizing is often a way to shortcut complexity because there's a lot of complexity. And we have a tendency to think that we're synthesizing it, but typically what we do when we synthesize is we're actually dumbing it down to a level that's not real. You don't need to synthesize. What you need to do is explain every little thing. In explaining every little thing, it's automatically going to describe the synthetic experience. But again, let's understand something. The synthetic experience, or what seems like one kind of action, is actually a mixture of a whole bunch of things. Like I said in the beginning, when we're trying to synthesize or turn something into something so simple, what we tend to do is shortcut that beautiful, mysterious complexity that I just sort of described in that one thing. And again, I just described a couple things about it. There's a lot of other things I could have said. Like Scorpio is an insect Rashi, Scorpio is fixed water, it's about going deeper, and there's all kinds of things I could have said. I started with just kind of the most, sort of the highest leverage things that have, in many ways, the most impact. But, for instance, if it was 6th house, we're talking about a Gemini person, right? If it would have been in the 6th. So there's all kinds of things that I didn't say. But this gives you an indication of how, when you actually just describe every little thing, a synthesis is achieved. And the synthesis, though, is honoring the complexity. You don't need to try to reduce things to one sentence. It's impossible. And again, the more we try to do this, the more we're often reducing it to some black and white, because that's usually the next thing that follows. Well, what does that mean? Is it good or bad? And that's silly, right? There's always the range of good and bad. And once you learn every little thing and you learn the priority and the sequence, again, a big important thing when learning any subject that you've learned, it was unfolded to you in a certain priority, things that were the most important, and in a certain sequence. And this is what I focus on in my certification program as well. You need to start with the concepts. I did a video a while ago about, starting with things from the conceptual level first, and then coming down to the level of technique in order to get results. So the concepts themselves, the principles, are more important. So first you need to understand the principles, then you can fit all of these things in those principles. Then when you go to explain them, you have a framework that you're working from rather than just kind of pulling things all over the place, which is typically what happens and why people's explanations of astrological concepts are typically really quite hard to follow and not repeatable. That's the other thing, is you're not talking about repeatable structures and concepts. So anyway, I hope this was interesting for you. Let me know what you think.